Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We always love tackling those topics that are really close to your heart, and well, today is no different. We're diving deep into migration. But we're not just talking about the basics here. We're going way beyond the headlines to explore the link between migration, the global economy, and something that maybe you haven't heard much about: informality.
Yeah, and for anyone out there, who might be listening and thinking about migrating, especially from a developing country, this is crucial stuff. It's about seeing the whole picture, not just your own personal goals, but how everything fits together.
That's so true. It's about context, right? But before we go too far, could you break down what informality actually means, for those who might not be familiar with the term?
Sure, sure. Think of it like working outside those traditional systems. Maybe you don't have benefits, maybe you're operating a bit outside the usual rules and regulations, and honestly, it's more common than you might think. Globally, something like 60% of workers are in this category.
60%. Whoa, okay, that's huge. So for this deep dive, we're really focusing on this 2023 academic paper from Critical Sociology. And full disclosure, the title is a bit of a mouthful: Migration, Informality, and Unequal Exchange in the Context of the Mexico-U.S. Regional Integration Process. But trust me, it is packed with insights.
Oh, absolutely. And for our listener who's particularly interested in those migration stats and the impact on people coming from, developing nations, this paper, it offers a really unique perspective
Yeah.
because it digs into that Mexico-US dynamic, which, let's be honest, is like a major migration route. But what's cool is the lessons here, they apply way beyond just those two countries.
I love that it's specific but also universal. Okay, so the paper kicks off talking about this thing called uneven development. Can you explain what that means in, plain English?
Basically, the idea is that global capitalism, by its very nature, creates this unequal distribution of wealth, right? And resources. So you end up with these big concentrations of workers in certain areas. It's what they call the reserve army of labor. And, these are often places where opportunity is scarce and informality, well, it thrives.
Okay, yeah, starting to see the connection here. So it's like people are almost forced to migrate because they lack opportunities at home.
Exactly. And the paper throws out this really stark statistic. Over 90% of informal workers, they're in low-income countries. Compare that to like less than 20% in high-income countries. So you can see how this gap, this huge disparity is like a major driver of migration. People are looking for a better life, and often countries like the US, with its higher demand for labor, they become the magnet.
Makes sense. But it's funny, because when we think of migration to the U.S., for Mexico especially, it's easy to fall into this stereotype of like low-wage jobs, right? But this paper, it challenges that a bit. It talks about how Mexico has become a major labor source for the U.S. in a way more complex way.
Oh, for sure. It's not just people directly migrating for, those typical low-wage jobs. There's this whole other layer. The paper talks about export platforms. Think of them like factories in Mexico, but they're mostly assembling goods with parts that come from somewhere else. It's not really about Mexico becoming industrialized. It's more like they're exporting their workforce, both literally through migration and virtually through these platforms.
Whoa, so it's like a double whammy.
Yeah.
Mexico is sending its people to the U.S. and producing goods for the U.S. using this often informal labor.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting point. We've been talking about informality in like developing countries, but it exists in the U.S. too.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We tend to think of informality as a them problem, not an us problem, right?
Totally. And this paper, it busts those myths wide open. It's not just undocumented immigrants. You're talking self-employment, people lacking benefits, even some skilled professionals working in, less than ideal situations. Get this. In 2021, over half of employed Mexican migrants in the U.S., they were in informal work, which is actually higher than the informality rate in Mexico itself.
Wow, that is so surprising. You think coming to the U.S. would be a guaranteed ticket to, like, formal employment and a better life, but clearly it's not that simple.
Not at all. And it highlights how important it is to really understand the nuances of informality, how it operates in different places and in different ways.
For sure. Okay, so we've seen how economics and this informality thing really set the stage for migration.
Yeah.
Now, there's another concept in the paper that I found super interesting: the idea of a South-North subsidy through remittances.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one, and especially relevant to our listener who's curious about how migration impacts developing countries.
Can you unpack that a bit? Because
Yeah.
it's not just about the money being sent back home,
Right.
right? It's something bigger.
It's way more than that. The paper argues that when migrants send those remittances, it's actually a transfer of value that goes beyond just, like, the dollar amount. Think of it this way. Countries like Mexico, they invest in their people, right? Education, healthcare, you name it, all before they migrate.
Right, that makes sense.
But when those people leave, that investment, it basically leaves with them. They're now contributing their skills and knowledge to a different economy, and that creates what the paper calls this subsidy from the south to the north.
So it's like even though remittances bring money back, there's this hidden cost in terms of lost investment in the home country.
Exactly. And the paper uses this really powerful figure to illustrate this. From 1994 to 2021, Mexico effectively subsidized the U.S. by almost 50% more than what it actually received in remittances.
That is mind-blowing. It really makes you think about all those complex economic dynamics that are happening behind the scenes.
For sure. And it challenges that simple idea that, migration is just about individuals wanting a better life. It's tied to these much bigger global forces that we often don't even think about.
Couldn't agree more. And on top of that, the paper talks about this idea of super exploitation, especially in economies like Mexico's. Can you break that down for us and how it might relate to our listeners' potential migration journey?
Absolutely. This concept comes from Rui Mauro-Marini, a really important Latin American economist. He argued that in a lot of developing economies, wages, they're just not enough to actually support workers. They have to rely on family, their community, these informal networks to get by. And that makes them super vulnerable to exploitation, hence the term super exploitation.
So how does this tie into migration then?
Well, if you're already struggling to make ends meet back home, even with help from family, the idea of moving to a place with higher wages, well, it can seem like the answer. But as we've seen, even in developed countries like the US, informality is a reality. And that means you might just end up continuing that cycle of low-wage work independence.
It's like a catch-22 almost. You're pushed to migrate because of hardship, but then you might face those same challenges in your new country.
Yeah.
A lot to consider for someone thinking about making that move, right?
No doubt. And that's why understanding these bigger economic forces, it's so crucial. It's not just about making a personal choice. It's about knowing the system you're stepping into and making informed decisions based on that knowledge.
Okay, so we've covered a lot.
Oh,
Uneven development, pushing people to migrate, Mexico as this major labor source, the truth about informality in both countries, and this South-North subsidy thing. What's next? Where do we go from here?
well, next we can dive into how even skilled professionals from Mexico are increasingly migrating to the U.S. But here's the kicker. They're actually facing higher rates of informality than their U.S.-born counterparts. It's a trend that really complicates things and raises some really important questions.
That sounds fascinating. Let's dive into that in part 2.
It's amazing how migration is changing. It's not just about those low-wage jobs anymore. We're seeing more and more skilled professionals from Mexico, doctors, engineers, heading to the U.S. But here's the thing. Even they are facing higher rates of informality than people born in the U.S.
That's crazy. I mean, you'd think with all that education and those specialized skills,
Mm-hmm.
finding formal work wouldn't be a problem. Why is that happening?
Well, the paper brings up a few things. One is, getting your credentials recognized. Sometimes those qualifications you get in Mexico, they don't totally transfer over to the U.S. system, so that limits your options right off the bat.
Oh, so even if they have the skills, they're hitting these bureaucratic roadblocks.
Yeah, pretty much. And then, of course, there's the language barrier and cultural differences. Those always played a role. But maybe even more interesting is how this trend of skilled migration ties back to what we were talking about earlier, Mexico's enclave economy. Something to think about if you're considering working in Mexico before heading north.
Right, enclave economy. Can you remind me what that is again?
Sure, it's basically like certain economic zones, they operate almost separately from the rest of the country. The paper specifically mentions these programs like IMEX that encourage these export-oriented factories in Mexico.
Ah, yeah, those export platforms we talked about.
Exactly. So these IMEX factories, they often work with imported parts and they get these tax breaks, but they're not really integrated into the bigger Mexican economy. They're like these little bubbles of economic activity, often relying on subcontracting and labor practices that look a lot like the informality we've been discussing.
So even though they're technically formal businesses on paper, they're still feeding into this overall system of informality.
Exactly. And that can create a kind of brain drain. Skilled professionals, they might see better opportunities, even if they're informal up in the U.S., or they feel like they've got a better shot at at getting ahead and having their skills recognized.
So it's like a push and pull, right?
Yeah.
Informality in the U.S. is drawing people in, while Mexico's own economic structure, with these enclaves, might be pushing them away at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it just goes to show that, simple solutions like just stricter border control, they're not going to cut it.
Absolutely. If the root causes are, like, economic and systemic, then the solutions got to address those deeper issues too.
Right. And that brings up a big question for someone considering migration, right? What does all this mean for them? The truth is, migration, it's complicated. There's no easy answer. It's this mix of personal hopes, economic pressures, and all these big global forces we've been talking about.
So it's not as simple as just, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, like some people say.
Nope, not at all. It's about understanding the system, knowing the risks and the rewards, and then making a choice that makes sense for your situation. And it's about pushing for policies that actually address the root causes of migration on both sides of the border.
One thing that really hit home for me in this paper is how it challenges that idea that informality is just a developing country problem. It's happening right here in the U.S., even for people with advanced degrees.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes you rethink who's really benefiting from informality and who's getting hurt. It's not black and white. It's way more nuanced than that. This paper really pushes you to think about those gray areas. It makes you think about the choices we make every day, even as consumers, Like, if we're buying things that were made under informal conditions, even if it's happening right here in the U.S., are we part of the problem?
Well, that's a tough one. I don't think most people stop to think about that when they're shopping. But it's definitely something to consider.
For sure, because as consumers, we have power. We can shape the kind of economy we want to live in. Part of that is knowing where our stuff comes from and what kind of labor went into making it.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's shown me how complex migration really is and how it's tied to informality in ways I never imagined. It's not just about people wanting a better life. It's about this global system that creates winners and losers, And understanding that system is key, especially for someone thinking about migrating from a developing country.
Exactly, you nailed it. It's about realizing that the line between formal and informal, it's not always so clear, and that both systems can exist together, even in developed economies like the U.S. This paper really challenges us to rethink how we define progress and development, and to see the hidden costs of the way our economy works.
Okay, so just to recap, we've talked about uneven development that drives migration, Mexico's role as this major labor source, the truth about informality in both countries, that hidden cost of remittances, the idea of super exploitation, the brain drain, and even Mexico's enclave economy. And we've highlighted how all these things are connected and how they impact individual decisions about migrating.
We've covered so much, but honestly, we've only scratched the surface of this whole topic.
That's true. And that brings us to the big question for our listeners. What does this all mean for you, especially if you're thinking about migrating? Hopefully this deep dive is giving you a lot to chew on.
It's a decision that shouldn't be taken lightly. You have to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks, knowing that the path to a good life, it's not always easy or obvious, and that informality, it can be lurking even in those opportunities that seem really promising.
And for everyone else listening, whether you're passionate about migration or just want to understand the world better, remember this. Migration isn't some far-off issue. It's connected to our everyday lives, our economies, the choices we make as consumers. It's all part of the same fabric.
And the fight for fair labor practices and economic justice, it's global. Whether it's the conditions facing informal workers in Mexico, the challenges migrants face here in the U.S., or even people struggling within developed economies, we're all part of this system. Finding solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few, that's what really matters.
So well said. This has been one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
I agree. It's amazing how one academic paper can spark so many big questions.
Right. So to our listener, if you're walking away with more questions than answers, that's actually a good thing. It means you're really engaging with these complex issues and thinking critically. And that's what the deep dive is all about. Sparking your curiosity, challenging your assumptions, and encouraging you to keep exploring the topics that matter most. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep diving.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Where do we go from here? I mean, this paper doesn't exactly give us like a step-by-step plan, but it definitely makes you think, shakes things up a bit.
It really does. For someone who's, thinking about migrating, especially from a developing country, it's easy to see it as like the solution to your problems, the answer to economic hardship.
Yeah.
But like we've been talking about, it's way more complicated than that.
And even for those of us who aren't planning on migrating, this whole deep dive, it brings up some pretty big questions about like how our economies actually work and the role that informality plays in all of it. One of the things that really stuck with me from this paper is how it challenges that whole traditional view of informality. We're so used to thinking of it as like a bad thing, something to get rid of. But what if, instead of just trying to like stamp it out, we tried to understand it better? Like, what if we looked at it in a more nuanced way?
Interesting. So you're saying instead of just like cracking down on undocumented migrants or shutting down those informal businesses, we should be looking for ways to make the system, the whole system, more fair.
Exactly. It's about addressing those power imbalances that lead to exploitation, both within countries and between countries. It's about fighting for policies that support workers' rights no matter their immigration status. And it's about pushing for economic development that actually benefits everyone, not just those at the top.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say we need to shift our thinking a bit. Instead of just trying to eliminate informality, we need to figure out how we can maybe like harness it
Mhm.
or transform it into something that's more equitable.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's not easy, that's for sure. But it's a conversation we need to be having at every level, from like our own individual choices to global policy decisions. And this paper with this deep dive into migration and informality, it definitely got that conversation started for me.
Me too, definitely.
Yeah.
And hopefully for our listener as well.
So if you're out there thinking about migrating, I hope this deep dive has given you some things to really think about. It's a huge decision, and it's important to weigh those potential benefits against the risks, knowing that the path to a better life, it might not always be clear-cut. And that informality, it can pop up even in those situations that seem really promising at first.
And for everyone else tuning in, whether you're super passionate about migration or just curious about the world, remember, migration isn't some far-off issue that doesn't affect you. It's connected to everything, to our everyday lives, the way our economy works, even the choices we make when we're shopping. It's all linked.
And that fight for fair labor practices, for economic justice, it's a global fight. What's happening to informal workers in Mexico, the challenges migrants face here in the U.S., even those struggles in developed economies, we're all part of this same system. Finding solutions that work for everyone, not just a few, that's what we should be aiming for.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. This has definitely been one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
I agree. It's amazing how much one academic paper can make you think, right?
So to our listener, if you're finishing this episode with more questions than answers, that's actually a great sign. It means you're really wrestling with these complex issues, you're thinking critically, and that's what the deep dive's all about, sparking that curiosity, challenging those assumptions, and encouraging you to keep digging into those topics that matter most. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.